Welcome to Rock That Relationship, a podcast about all things relationship with Corey and Tracy.
Now let's get real and start creating relationships that rock.
Welcome, everyone, to another wonderful season of Rock That Relationship. I can't believe we are on season 9 already. Tracy, what do you think?
Why can't you believe it? Look at us.
Because
you do all the work.
Well, that's true. I can believe that I followed through to make this happen. But I remember back when we were talking about doing this podcast, we were walking up Timamook Hill. Well, we talked about it for months and months until we actually did it. And we made it happen. And here we are, going into, in our 80s. We've done 82 episodes. So, this is our
number 80s. Maybe we'll be doing it into our 80s. We'll still be on the podcast, like exactly, Dr. Ruth. We'll have a lot of topics to talk about.
Welcome to Rock That Relationship, season 111, but yeah, who knows? Anyways, well, awesome.
Well, by then, people will be married to robots and there'll be all kinds of different things to talk about, having relationships with robots. And that's a totally different, relationship dynamic than that with human on human. So,
okay, well, maybe
we'll have a lot to talk about in the
shift
future.
That. Well, this season, as we kind of giggle and laugh, it isn't really a giggling and laughing kind of topic, but it's a really important topic as we explore the idea of navigating divorce. And, when we talk about relationships, we're talking about not just those that you're in, but maybe those that you're transitioning out of. And how do you do that in a way that's healthy and productive and emotionally and physically safe for you to do that? And we want to talk a lot about kind of the process of divorce. With Tracy's background, it being a family attorney and things around mediation, and my background with emotional intelligence and conflict negotiation, we figured this would be a really good topic to delve into. And then also bringing on experts, as we typically do, to really explore some of the nuances of navigating divorce. What are your thoughts on this season and the importance of this season, Tracy?
I think it's extremely important. I think we have to talk about the difference between like a relationship breakup and a divorce, and why divorce is its own separate entity. Divorcing is ending a legal contract, whereas a relationship, unless you've come up with a legal contract for that relationship, generally doesn't involve a lot of legal matters. But divorce does. It's very easy to get married. It's real cheap to get married. It's usually pretty expensive to get divorced if there's any conflict at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I like the distinction between those because, with marriage, you're dealing with the, kind of the termination of a legal contract at the same time as your emotional termination of that relational contract that you have. Right. And that those two get conflated a lot. And that's why I know you're in, in situations where you're working with a client potentially, and it's emotional and it's heated and it's all these things because, getting out of a legal contract while you're getting out of a relational, emotional contract is very difficult.
Yes. And I do tell all of my clients it takes 2 to 3 years to recover financially, emotionally, and physically from a divorce. And that can even be, a divorce that's done amicably. So imagine a contentious divorce that can take a long, long time for people to work through. And a lot of that is the financial stuff, right? And just becomes, people become very attached, which in a lot of cases they should, because, they made an agreement to have children and to be married and to share resources. And then you really find out what the other person's about when the divorce process gets started.
Yeah.
What kind of person are they?
Exactly. Well, being a child of divorce, a messy divorce at that, and then I've never been married because marriage was not legal for same-sex couples when I was in a situation like that. But I did have a registered domestic partnership, and we did have some paperwork. It was a little bit different than divorce, but we did have some legal untanglings we had to do as we owned assets together, and we shared, a child and all those kind of things. And so there's a lot that really goes into that kind of a separation that's really, really different than other breakups where you pack your stuff and you leave. And
even if you're in a relationship and you own property together, but you're not married, that's not dealt with in the family courts. It's dealt with in civil court. So I think everyone should just be very careful before joining finances, buying property together, starting a business together. All of these things people are so excited about when they first talk about it with somebody. having children with another person. I don't know that people realize what that means is you're going to be with that person, dealing with that person for decades, right? And you don't have any control over them. Really, the court does. So people need to think, I think, a lot more carefully about marriage, about having children, and about buying property and or starting businesses with be it a partner or another person. Because all that stuff can get so complicated to untangle and to end. Yep,
exactly. So, I mean, this episode is, really starting off at the basics is, should I get divorced, right? I mean, whether it's you talking to clients and talking about whether or not they should maybe try to work things out, or, do they really want to get divorced, or if it's even just talking to friends or family members who say, like, I'm not sure that I want to be in this, and really kind of grappling with those questions. So let's take a look at some of the most common reasons people get divorced and kind of unpack those a little bit. And so there's a lot of things online about this, but divorce.com, they put together a great an article, and we'll link to it in the show notes here. But it's really about consolidating some studies about what are the most common reasons people get divorced. And let's talk through those, because I think what we can do is not just highlight those, because people know why they're getting divorced, but talking about what are the implications of those particular reasons on the divorce process, right? So, for instance, one of the main reasons people can't get or they choose to get divorced is they just can't get along. There's too much conflict. There's incessant arguing. There's actually 31.9% of respondents who got divorced said that it was communication problems between the partners. Sometimes it's unrealistic expectations. It's just not being able to get along. And so if you think about that, if that's the reason for ending the relationship, how does that get carried then into the divorce process and the recovery process? What are your thoughts on that? If you're coming from a position where you're not able to get along with your spouse and you're ending things, how might that impact the divorce process in your mind?
Well, it impacts it hugely, because how are you going to be able to get divorced if you couldn't even be married? And that's why either mediation helps. So if there's not a lot of assets, there's not kids maybe, or you're pretty much in agreement, but you just can't seem to finalize things, and go to a mediator, because that's going to be a lot less expensive. Once you hire an attorney, that attorney is hired to represent you, and it kind of can even escalate the tension sometimes. So you need to, once you decided to hire an attorney, you need to know that that's going to ratchet things up, right? And also the cost. And usually then the other party gets an attorney. Now that can be good in some cases, because then you have an attorney talking, which for the most part should seem like it would be a better thing than the two people who couldn't, stay married. But each of those people go to that attorney and tell them their story, right? And so if they weren't communicating well in the first place, now they're telling one person's telling an attorney this story, and the other person's telling this, and then the attorneys are, advocating for their client. And so I think that, I always say this: if you're going to start out a relationship, you should start out with some kind of relationship help, even if you think you're the healthiest person, right? Because relationships are not easy. And we talk about this constantly on the podcast: communication, therapy. It would help a lot, because it really, all of that, everything that you've had in the marriage that was wrong in the marriage is going to occur in the divorce as well. And it's going to complicate things.
Well, and I really resonate with your point of this idea of kind of ratcheting things up with a lawyer. So maybe mediation, of having someone help with that communication, might be a good first step in that. But also recognizing that if you do have a difficult time communicating, and that was part of the reason for divorcing, you're going to probably have a difficult time communicating even more so in the divorce process. Right. And being able to head that off before it inflames itself and creates more problems is going to be really important.
But here's the thing about mediation: it requires two parties who are willing to voluntarily, work out things. So sometimes it's not possible. And people say, if there's conflict, it's both parties. Well, that's not true at all. There can be if there's one high conflict person in the relationship, it can really, it can cause a lot of problems. Yeah.
And that's maybe when you're talking about getting lawyers and communicating through them. It's really being able to see that. And I think your point kind of moves us to the next one is, you know, 75% of people, and again, you could check more than one box. That's why these aren't going to total 100%. But 75% of people said that they got divorced because of a lack of commitment. And not just a commitment like they were cheating per se, but they just weren't in it. They had lack of emotional, physical intimacy. They thought maybe one person wasn't carrying their weight in the marriage. They didn't support each other's goals. They just weren't in it. And so when you're talking about something like mediation, going into that process with someone who wasn't even into the marriage might not be a willing partner in something that takes a little more effort like mediation. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it could be, but also sometimes the mediator, if they're good, right? A mediator is just a facilitator. And I did do mediation, and I had clients come, you know, couples come, and they did not like each other at first, and they were angry. But, you know, with a good facilitator explaining, like, why it's better to do it this way, especially if you don't have, you know, super, super big issues. Like, you're going to save a ton of money, which is going to be helpful to both parties. And lack of commitment to a relationship is different than lack of commitment to getting out of a relationship, right? So actually, I would think it's the inverse. So if you don't have that much commitment to the marriage, you're likely to just want to be done and out, you know?
Yeah, so you may do whatever it takes to kind of just wrap this up quickly and
right.
and go.
Right.
Because, you know, unlike what we just talked about, kind of those high conflict situations where you get ego involved and you get like, I want to win. And then they go, you know, this happened with my parents. They went back and forth for years arguing over what probably wasn't all that much and probably way more in legal fees to do because they were, you know, conflictual. Whereas if they both just wanted out, you know, pretty quickly, they might have just walked away. And
well, when that happens, it's either they're mad about something or they're upset about the relationship ending, right? And so when I actually talk to clients, like one of the first thing I ask is, are you sure that you want to get divorced? Like, have you guys tried therapy? Have you tried to work this out? Like, is this a done deal? And then they start to tell me the story, and it becomes clear they're at the, you know, that place. And now I've had a client reconcile with her husband recently, which I was very happy about. And so it's not like, oh, yay, I want everyone to get divorced. But like once you start talking to someone, you could tell whether they're done or not, right? But those people you're talking about, like your parents, there's someone in there was very controlling, and the other person also doesn't want to just walk away from everything. It's not fair, right? But they're either usually clinging to, they're really hurt by what that person did. They can't get over it, and they want to punish them, or like they still want to be with that person and they can't let go, you know?
Right. Well, yeah. And they've been, you know, in the case of my parents, my mom felt very wronged by my dad and didn't want to let him off the hook without being in pain, as much pain as she was from the reason why they got divorced. And so that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, that kind of transitions us into another kind of bucket of reasons people get divorced is things around abuse, you know, domestic violence, infidelity, affairs, addiction, trust issues, those kinds of like what we would consider sort of the major violations. 23.5% of people said that the reason they got divorced was because of domestic violence. 59.6% said infidelity or an extramarital affair. 34.6% said addiction was involved.
I have to say something about domestic violence because I think those statistics would be higher if women weren't murdered. So I think that some are exited from that relationship by violence, and then the rest who get out, you know, they get out early enough that it doesn't come to that, or they're able to protect themselves. So I think that statistic on domestic violence is really low.
Yeah, and the fact that it's already 23.5% feels pretty high. And so that is, you know, in some ways, you know, terrifying. So we have these things, these kind of big, huge betrayals of sorts. Now you have a situation like this. You're in this situation, and of course we are not experts in helping with any kind of physical trauma, domestic violence. There are certainly great resources out there to help with those kinds of things, and therapy to help with those. But at least from kind of an advisory perspective, or at least an observable perspective, Tracy, what kinds of things have you seen that kind of work best if you're getting divorced and you've been in a situation like one of these? What are some of the best strategies for going into the divorce process?
Well, I'd say I'm much higher than an advisor. I mean, I was a domestic violence victim advocate. I worked at a domestic violence shelter. I was a police officer. So I have dealt with domestic violence for decades. And, that's one of the first things that I ask about. And, safety is paramount. So when you're in a domestic violence situation, it's really like your hierarchy of needs have to be met, right? Safety is your first. Like nothing else will matter if you're not safe. And so if you are in a domestic violence situation, you need to get help immediately. And that means either calling and getting, the police to come when that person is being violent, getting an order of protection and then enforcing that order of protection while understanding that an order of protection doesn't actually protect you. It only allows you to enforce violations of it. You need to learn how to physically defend yourself, and not only defend yourself either with a weapon or something, have somebody else be defending you. You need to be aware at all times of your surroundings. So that's a whole episode, that's probably a whole series on domestic violence. There's a lot to consider in there, but the first thing that person needs to think about is, how can I be safe? How can I and or my children be safe? And that means setting up serious boundaries and making plans for protecting yourself.
Right, and leaving that space, whatever that might mean. The other thing too, I know that's really important here, and again, we're not here to give. We can talk about more, general ideas, but we're not here to give any specific legal advice to people. But the idea is that if you're in this kind of a situation, is absolutely, getting protection and being safe. But I also think of this when we go into the divorce process, is that this can really amp up this situation where if there's somebody who is kind of the abuser or the person who might be at fault of these things, who is particularly if there's anger issues involved, that it could escalate the potential for kind of post-choosing divorce violence, or post-issues. Even somebody, we look at something not just a violence, but we look at addiction. Somebody who might be addicted might go out on a bender or a binge after the divorce. But it is not the responsibility of the other person to make sure that their future ex-spouse is safe and okay. It's their job to make sure that they themselves, their children, or whoever are also safe. Right. But when you're going into a, kind of a divorce situation, I know that, one of the things I know you've dealt with is just kind of get in and get out and wrap this up, because sometimes what ends up happening is that maybe the person who is the abuser in this case tries to reach out offline to the other person and tries to talk to them or and that's where you're talking about the order of protection. And so some of these things that happen, sort of we call like shadows, right, behind the scenes, can be very scary for people. And so I don't know, you talk about maybe some of your situation with that, or you've seen that.
Well, I mean, they, whatever city they're in or wherever they're living, they need to find some domestic violence resources and get help with those. I mean, that's number one. If you don't have something local, then find something national and educate yourself about how to keep yourself safe, But it is, I mean, some of these end in murder, so it's not a light topic, Right. And I deal with it every day with multiple clients, and I counsel my clients on how to best protect themselves, but I'm not there 24/7. The police aren't there 24/7, So, and that's the thing. I mean, just if you're going to go, I don't ever victim blame, but people need, I shouldn't say and people need to recognize when little things start to happen in a relationship that are a domestic violence red flags, they need to get out early. You need to get out early. So I think that is like that should be its own whole series, but.
I mean, super important. And I mean, as we're talking about it in the same vein as we're talking about affairs, right? Right. Betrayals, which isn't necessarily maybe a safety issue, at least it's not maybe a physical safety issue, but an emotional safety issue, or addiction, right? When you start seeing the signs of addiction as, if
you decide to stay or not to stay. And I mean, exactly. A lot of people try and work through things. I just talked to a guy yesterday who his wife was cheating. They went to counseling. Then she started up cheating again with the same person. And, he's super reasonable about it. And he's, wanting to be friends. They're going to live in the same neighborhood after the divorce. And I was really impressed by his lack of anger. And I think that that's probably because of the therapy they've been through and stuff like that. So, I mean, again, if like stuff like that happens, I don't think people can work through it on their own. They need to seek the professional help right away. Because it's one thing for people to have an open marriage and for them to decide to have other partners, and that's their prerogative, right? But it has to be consensual. Again, everything's got to be consensual and above board. So, I mean, when we talk about cheating and all that, I mean, that's doing things behind people's back, which is never okay in a relationship,
Right. It's betrayal. It's dishonesty.
Right.
And so like these are the questions. You're in that situation is, can my marriage survive this betrayal? Whatever that is, whether that's infidelity, whether that's, I've seen, situations where partners have lied to their spouses about money and been spending money or shifting money out from places. So these like lies,
well, if anyone's lying, that needs to stop right away, or you need to leave, because if they're lying about one thing, they're lying about another thing, and that can financially ruin you. And that's the other thing. People tend to discount like how much marriage can financially ruin you, because you are now hooked to that person legally and their debts, especially in the state of Arizona, which is a 50-50 state. So any community property state, it's community property and community debt. So when you marry someone, you're taking on whatever debt they go out and get. So I mean, that freaks me out more than anything, right?
Right.
Like, how much debt is this? Like, it's shocking how much debt I see. Like, I am completely shocked. And this is after me being a police officer, a domestic violence shelter worker, and I'm doing private family law, and I'm shocked at the amount of debt that people have and how one other person can really just tank your life. So you need to be really, really careful. Yeah. You're going to marry someone.
Well, and I think about it too. It's like, it's not just as obvious as like, oh, where's the money in the bank account? It's like spouses are getting credit cards in their name, not telling you, jacking up a whole bunch of, of debt. And then, here you are on the hook for it. And so, the question is, where are you seeing these violations of trust? And so all of these sort of fall into that category of sort of violations of trust. And people are leaving. And so when you come into the divorce process again, you're maybe splitting up because you don't trust them. So having somebody to represent you, like a lawyer that you can trust, who will, sort of uncover things to make the process
you have
move.
To subpoena and uncover. When you say the word uncover, literally people are having to subpoena banks, subpoena credit card companies to see what their spouse is up to. I mean, it makes me sick. I've never been in that kind of situation, but I did date someone who lied. Thank God we didn't have any joined anything, but that was what was worse to me, was the lying than anything else. Because what else is going on if you're lying about this?
Right. If you're lying about one thing, maybe lying about another. All right, let's shift gears a little bit to another reason that people tend to split up. And this is not nearly as heavy as what we just talked about, but compatibility issues, like opposing values or morals. We had a whole season on navigating differences in relationships, whether you have a political difference with someone, you might have a religious difference with someone. In this case, parenting differences. Maybe you just have different approaches. It could also be not just differences, but you just have a lack of shared interests or lifestyle incompatibilities. One partner's a homebody and the other one likes to be out, or you don't have any interest in common. So you build two almost like simultaneous lives next to each other. But the idea is that somehow, some way, you're not fully compatible. So I know this seems to be in some ways less maybe hostile than some of the other reasons why people would break up, because sometimes it does also result in communication issues and these other things. But, what's your take on compatibility issues? And when people come into the divorce process with compatibility issues, how can they best navigate that process?
I mean, I have a couple of those now where it's really not high conflict. It's just that, things weren't working. And once they got married or spent enough time together, or as the world changes, people change, or as they age, they change. And so those are a little bit easier. I mean, you still end up with conflict. You still end up with, having to go back and forth on stuff. But I would say that, I mean, those seem to be the least anger inducing. Like, sometimes people can just say, okay, well, we're just very different on these things. And you could say, well, how come you didn't figure that out before? But, you don't really know someone until years into the relationship. And usually people get married before that stage. And I do think the world is changing so rapidly with technology, with like access to certain things that, we never had before, that like people are actually changing. And I don't believe that whole thing when people say, people can't change, or they're too old to change, or this. I don't think that's true at all. People change in many ways. And some people choose to grow and become better people, and some people don't. And so that does lead to a lot of divorce. And sometimes those people can, do mediation. And sometimes, like I have a client who's, talked to her partner, and they're going to work out their settlement before we file the paperwork. So, I represent her, but they're talking and they're staying in the same home for right now. So, it's not super, they need our help, but I don't need to, you know what I mean? Like I'm not a buffer in this situation. I'm just a helper to help, move the divorce along. So, those aren't super high conflict.
Well, and that's good. And, we talk about the changing, right? You're talking about people changing all the time too, is, this is going to be a very strange reference, but if you ever watch that show, My 600-Pound Life, there's these, it's a very good show. Anyways, there's usually someone on there that wants to go get like weight loss surgery, and they want to become healthy and fit. And then they go home and they need to eat all this healthy food, and their partner really struggles with it. And it puts a lot of tension on the relationship because they're both used to, kind of eating the same thing, in some ways being sedentary, all of these things. And now you have one of the partners who really wants to physically change their life. And almost all of these couples from the shows that I've watched end up in divorce. Right, shortly after this weight loss surgery. And this is just an example of one thing where, one person might take up a hobby and all of a sudden get really into that hobby and be gone all the time doing that hobby with people. It could be that they join a religious group, or they change their politics, and and so there is a potential for there to become some kind of resentment of the change. So I like the ones that are just, we're incompatible, we get it, and we just need Tracy to help us facilitate through this. But then there's those ones that can grow to these other points of contentiousness that we've talked about, where it's like, I resent you for abandoning me. You went on this weight loss journey without me, or I resent you for taking up this hobby and never spending time with me. And so some of those changes also are just really, like I said, can be almost like the gateway to other problems and other issues. And then being able to identify that so that you can see how these are all in there. So I'm really happy that you have
and to say, is it enough for me to want to leave this relationship, right?
Exactly. Or do we just have to talk about it, the fact that we have changes? Right.
I think that you have to say, like, is this enough to leave this relationship over? Do I want this to be done? Which, that's why, like, going forward, I'm trying to be more careful when I get into a relationship, and not even a marriage, just a relationship, that I have that. Those aren't things that are likely going to change, but I understand they could change, but that I want to make sure that we have those compatibilities at first, And like, I'm a real minimalist, and I live in a way that a lot of people find, annoying. I don't go out to eat a lot. I don't drink. I don't do all these things. And so I think there's people who, they like to go out to eat. They like to drink. They like to live in a way that I don't really live, and so that becomes even, like, I think that's pretty simple, but it does become a compatibility issue, Well,
especially if, like, about it on the front end. Like, I think about, like, if there's something that's really important to you and you're like, well, I can sort of compromise on that, and then you realize you can't compromise on that, is really, like, understanding what are those non-compromisable things. There are certain things in my world that are just, I don't want it to change. I want to be with someone, for instance, who values being active, right? And having, even if it's different hobbies than mine, but just being active, being outside, that's really important for me. So on the front end, I want to pick somebody who I'm more likely to be compatible with than that, rather than hoping that they'll change over the course of our relationship. If I just take them outside enough, they're going to want to be out there with me. And then it's like, they're not, then I'm surprised. And then, we're married 10 years. I'm like, this ends up rearing its head. And so that front end piece is really important. All right, let's talk a little bit about money, less about the idea of money in terms of, like, financial ruin or debt and those kind of things. But the idea that 36.7% of people said that they divorced because of money. Some of it were financial problems, inability to make financial decisions that were, together. So one person was a spender, one was a saver. So more philosophies. The fact that they, one person may have chosen not to work while the other one did, and they just ran into some problems, or even that they just had financial struggles and together they just couldn't figure out how to work it out. That kind of thing. So money, you're coming into a divorce process because you can't seem to manage your money, or you've had money troubles or money setbacks. What are some thoughts about coming into the divorce process and being successful if this is the reason that you're breaking up?
Those aren't usually very successful as far as the people being able to come to agreement. So you usually just have to I did a 4.5-hour settlement conference on this issue the other day, and that's done by a judge that isn't your presiding judge. And that judge will say, look, here's where we're at, and this is what the judge is going to decide. So this is, this is probably a good deal for you. Those people really can't ever come to, those are really hard ones. They don't agree. And so you kind of just have to bring them to somebody who can point out to them, this is likely what's going to happen if you go to trial. So you can go to trial and spend all this money, litigating it, but you're likely to end up at this place. So,
which is kind of ironic, right?
Compromise, right?
It's ironic. You're going to spend more money to come back to this place.
The problem is they see things so differently, right? Money is a big deal, and people shouldn't take that as not a big deal. It's a big deal. I've been fiscally responsible my whole life, but I've never saved for retirement. So, I'm very different from other people who have. I did that for my ex-wife, but I didn't do it for myself. So, that might really bug someone who's retired or getting to retirement. They're going to live the high life, and I'm still working when I'm 90, So it's that can lead to a lot of resentment.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was thinking too, because this idea of there's this philosophy of equity, right? And so a lot of money problems are derived from this idea of inequity in the relationship. I made more than you, you made less than me, or I worked more than you and you worked less.
Well, I want to say something about that, because I see that a lot with men and women, the male and female dynamic, when women choose to have children for the family, where the man is on board with it while they're married, the man suddenly becomes not on board with it and becomes extremely hostile. And I did this and I made this money. And, with the woman's labor, just like in our school districts and all of these other places where female labor is free or very cheap, it's not valued. And so that actually makes me very angry. And that comes up a lot, and that is very hard to work out, because some people become extremely resentful about that, and I have a real issue with that, especially when kids are involved.
Well, in the idea of this idea that you're debating equity versus debating money, it's this idea of what's fair. I made this, I should keep this. It's not. It almost becomes less about the money and more about the idea of it's mine and I get to keep it, or you didn't earn it, or you don't deserve it.
But the state doesn't see it that way, everybody. I want to say this right now. The state does not see it that way. In a community property state, it does not matter whether you sat on your ass and did nothing for 10 years. That other person's property is yours. Their money, the money they saved in retirement, is now yours. So when I used to give you a hard time, Corey, about saying you wouldn't get married, now doing this work, I no longer will give you a hard time, because you would have to give over that money unless you had a really good prenup, right? And that's the thing. If you had a prenup that only covered what you had until that day, and then you get married and everything you're doing, if you're a hard worker and that other person's not working hard, now that's different than a person who is in social services or doing good for the world and they make less money. Or
staying at home to raise children, all those things.
And so I don't like the people who say, oh, I made more money. Well, you did a job and they did a job and you chose your field, but you were in a relationship. So in that case, I don't feel that just because one partner makes more, is a higher earner, does not mean that they did more work. And that's where I like the 50-50, where the state actually enforces that. So what I don't like are the people who do nothing and don't contribute, but also don't stay in that relationship with somebody who does nothing. If somebody does nothing and you're dating and you're seeing that they're doing nothing, or you get married and they're doing nothing, get out of that relationship. If that person's not helping you with the home, they're not helping you with anything, and they're going to benefit in the end, and then you are going to be really angry. But I don't like where, okay, one person's a higher earner and the other's not. They're both working. They're doing different things that are valued differently by society. Don't get in a relationship and then be a dick and say, I made more money. Because that is not nice, right? It's not kind. And don't get married then. Don't get in a relationship. If you have that kind of attitude, just stay out of it. Stay out of marriage, because this is going to, it will cause you a lot of problems in divorce, and it will cause you to be bitter for the rest of your life unless you get some serious therapy.
Well, and bitter in the relationship and then bitter in the divorce. Because, again, if you feel like that's your money, even if you're being a jerk about it and you feel like you earned more and that's your money, there's going to be more combative issues going through the divorce, because it's going to be a matter of ego. You don't deserve that. I deserve this. And that can be really difficult to find people to compromise when you feel like there's a balance of inequity, even whether it's divorce or not. It happens in any kind of conflict situation. If one person feels like they deserve something more than another person does, they will go to all ends of the earth to make sure that they fight for that, even in the fact that the state is 50-50 and they likely won't get that. The idea is that creates a lot of conflict and turbulence in any kind of negotiation that would happen.
Yeah.
And then and then ending up doing what you're talking about, where they're fighting and fighting and fighting, and here's what a judge says was likely going to happen, and then they keep fighting, and then they come right back to where they were, and they end up settling on that anyways. It's like the fight. It's about the fight. It's about what's mine, and I want to put my feet down on that.
Well, so that's why I do a lot of work with my clients about their peace and what's going to bring them the most peace.
Yes.
And to determine at the beginning, when we get started, what's your best case outcome? What can you live with? And what's going to get you the peace that you need to move on with your life, even if that person gets a little more than you think they should or is fair, But also knowing that a lot of people, when they are about to get divorced or whatever, I think particularly men will be like, I'm going to get the kids. I'm going to take this. I'm going to have that. You're going to have nothing. Well, that's why the state's the laws are good, because they do protect those people. Because people will say a lot, and I'll have people call me and they're like, he said he's going to get this. He said that. I'm like, that's just talk. Like, that person's just being abusive. That's just horrible things to say. It's not true.
Right. Well, especially like using the kids. Like, I'm taking the kids. Like, I'm going into this negotiation as a way to punish you. And it's like, oh, come on.
Children are they are the most used pawn in a divorce, which is really sad and pathetic commentary on the people who do that.
Yeah, awful. All right, let's shift to a couple other topics, I think, related to this. I think this is interesting. That 17.3%, while it was a fairly lower number, said that external family pressures are a reason they got divorced. Either the family doesn't like the spouse and just it wore them down after a while, or that the spouse doesn't like the intrusiveness of maybe their partner's parents or sibling or whatever it might be. Have you seen any of this or experienced this in your own life?
My own life, yes, but not really in divorce law yet, or mediation. I think if that's the case, they don't last very long. It's either, racial issues, religious issues, maybe LGBTQ issues. I think if those people are going to break up, the 17.3%, that seems very high to me. I think they're going to do it pretty early on, because they're not going to have any support,
Probably pre-marriage.
A relationship requires, support.
Yeah. Yeah, I would think definitely this would probably happen more so pre-marriage, and probably also exacerbate some of those other things, right? Like, so you have a lot of family pressure, which then creates maybe conflict in the home or incompatibility or other things that are probably more of the reason that you end up splitting up. But the external family pressure is certainly there. But that's got to be difficult. At some point you say, okay, like, if everybody in my life is telling me that this person is bad for me, whether they are or not, at some point maybe I just listen to them. And
maybe your family's prejudiced. Maybe your family's jerks. You know what I mean? You have to figure out for yourself, right? Like, where is that coming from? It could be that person's bad. It could be that the family's bad, but you have to know, right? But here's the thing, and also your statistics say that marrying too young, 45.1% of people, if you don't marry young, when you say marrying too young, right? So people will jump into marriage like, oh, their partner, their boyfriend or girlfriend's about to go in the military, they want to follow them, they get married, they're so young, right? But they're getting these benefits and whatnot, but now they're left alone a lot. I've seen this. And they really didn't know each other, right? Mm-hmm. So I think marriage, people can get married at the age of 16 in this country, which I think is abhorrent. I don't see any reason for teenagers to get married. And I really don't see reason for people in their early 20s to get married either. I mean, that very rarely works out. Maybe it will, and you're very lucky, right? But, like, I think that when it's marrying too young, what they're saying is that, like, they didn't know themselves well enough to know what would be good for them.
Yep. And that could also be this idea of marrying too soon, too, which is not necessarily a statistic we have, but this idea of, you know, you're getting married, you're like, this person's the one, I know it, and like 3 months later you elope. Now, that, you know, I've known that for people that have done that, and they're still together, and so it's not to rule that out, but just also there are very few circumstances in which there is a rush to get married. Right? Like if you need to get someone on benefits, they're going overseas for a war, they need the, you know, they, whatever the case may be, those kind of things.
They're going to die and then like and leave you're married. Right.
But there are.
Or that you had the experience of getting married before you died. I mean, there are legitimate.
Yes.
There's some kid I followed for years who I loved. He died of a very, very horrible cancer. And he and I think his girlfriend got married very young, and her family is, you know, everyone was like, are you sure you want to do this? But that was an experience that he got to have before he died. You know?
I mean, that makes sense. But, you know, if you're in a regular kind of typical situation and there's no reason you can't potentially wait a few months to get to know the other person. I mean, it's everybody's preference. But if a lot of people are saying that marrying too young, or in some cases marrying too quick, ends up creating a circumstance where you get divorced later on, you know, there's no harm in maybe dating for another year and just seeing.
Well, and getting support. So there are some things like, okay, we have covenant marriage in Arizona that you go to religious counseling first. Now, I don't advise. I agree with the counseling, but I don't agree with the covenant marriage, because in order to get divorced, you then have to go through these extremely strict procedures to get divorced. So if you putting yourself in that situation, you're not getting out of that marriage easily. So I personally advise against covenant marriage.
But you can still go get religious advising without having to have a covenant marriage, which a lot of people do find quite useful, is going to their place of, you know, someone that they respect in their spiritual community.
Marriage, there should be, I mean, there are premarital counseling. It's usually religious based, though. So there should be, for the secular people, you know, somebody should be doing that. I guess that's what I'll do, you know?
Right.
Premarital counseling. Is this really what you want? Is this what, like, these are all the things that are going to happen in this marriage, whether you like it or not, and legally, this is where you're at. Is this really what you want to be doing? And how well do you actually know this person? Right.
Because sometimes in the relationships I've been in, I'd probably say for me, it's taken about 2 years to get to some places where I felt like, all right, we're in a groove, and this is what life will be like in the long term. And have a better idea 2 years in what I'm looking at versus 2 months or 6 months in. And that's just for me. I mean, everybody has their own threshold, but for me, I'm like, okay, I can probably tell you right around the 2-year mark if this is where I'm going. And so, because there's a lot of things that are really different. You know, I was just talking with somebody about this the other day, this idea of we don't even realize that sometimes at the beginning of relationships, we compromise, even subconsciously compromise on things because we're just sort of, getting along and we're in this honeymoon stage. But once we get through that, we realize that there are some things we just don't want to compromise on, even if we have been doing it. And all of a sudden now we're in a state of conflict because we're 2 years in, 3 years in, 4 years in, whatever the case may be. And now you're like, listen, I don't really want to compromise on that. Whatever the case may be, even if it's the smallest thing. And so part of it is spending some time to get to know people and work through that, what I would consider is like not just the honeymoon stage, but the compromising stage.
Right. Because you're going to have to compromise in divorce.
Yes, you sure are.
And you're not going to like it. It's going to happen. So.
Right. Okay, so here's kind of our last bucket of things that are really specific to people that are older, and reasons why they might get divorced, which are different. One is empty nesting, not having really much of a purpose after the child leaves or the children leave, or not feeling a sense of connection with each other because the connection was through the children. Inconsistent retirement plans. I know this is one that, you and I have talked about at great length, being in our age group, is, what if you're with someone who's retired and you're not retired? They want to travel all the time and you're not able to, or vice versa. Also, like if they're hanging around the house and just, kind of just reading, and you're like, why aren't you working? Financial issues that are different when you're older. You might be having a lower income because you're not working or you're retired. Declining health, where one has to be a caregiver of another. So talk to me about older individuals. What do you think in terms of them, kind of considering divorce? Have you seen any of these kind of rear their head in the divorces you've worked with?
Yes. And I find it sad that, people were married for 30-something years and now they're getting divorced. And I'm like, well, what hope does that give for like a lifelong relationship? Maybe that's not possible, or it's only possible for a few people. But also it makes me hopeful that like, okay, well, now they're not going to be miserable. Usually those people have been miserable for years.
Yeah.
So in a long-term marriage like that ends in divorce, they've usually been miserable for many, many years. So
yep.
That's the thing. I think like it is hopeful in the fact that, okay, well, you can recalibrate your life. You can change up your life. You can say like, I don't need to stay with this person who's unhappy, or they're making me unhappy. So it's like a double-edged sword. It's both sad and happy and hopeful,
Yeah,
But,
well, and some of these things are the causes of the divorce, and some of them are just the predicators of the timing of the divorce. Like, we stayed together for the kids, and now that they've left to go to college, empty nesting isn't causing the divorce. Empty nesting is the reason that we can now maybe entertain divorce in ways that were different than when the kids were home, or retire.
I think there's two ways to look at empty nesting, though, the way you just described it. And when you're empty nesting, you're like, we grew apart, we changed, or we never really had that much in common. And they didn't even realize it, right? Some people may realize it and say, we're staying together until our kids get to a certain age, and they know what they're doing. And then other people are just automatic. And then when they have downtime without those kids, they're like, we're not really that compatible. I really don't like you. I mean, that happens.
Yeah, I don't want to be stuck in the house without
and it's better just to leave.
Other person. Yeah, exactly. And same with like retirement plans. It might be that, it's like, I'm going to be retiring, but my partner's going to be working for 10 more years or something, and I want to just kind of go travel and see the world, and I don't, want to be kind of tied down, and maybe it's time to go.
Unless that person decides that you should each have your own retirement plans, you're forking over a lot of that money. So
yeah,
people may decide that, and they're like, I want to go travel. Well, you're going to be a little bit less rich than you were before, because that person's going to get the money.
Yeah,
that's a fact, and you're going to be forced to sell your house. Because usually either one of you doesn't want to buy the other one out. So then the house is put on the market, and it may not be an ideal time. And also then you also have to go buy property or get an apartment. And now you're paying more than you were before. So before that happens, I really talk to that client, like, are you sure that this is what you want? Right? Like, how unhappy have you been? Because people really need to go to marital counseling before they make this decision, because if you're talking about, maybe like I have a friend who has Parkinson's, okay? His wife travels all the time. He doesn't want to travel. He wants to stay home with the dog. That's fine. They don't have a problem with that. If they were to go to get divorced now, it would be all hell would break loose as far as financially, right? And it is more expensive to have two households than it is to have one.
Right.
And so when people think, I'm going to divorce this lazy person, or I'm going to divorce this person I've been with for 30-something years, and then I'll be living high off the hog because I saved for retirement and she didn't, well, guess what? She's getting some of that money. And now you're in a position where you're supporting yourself, and so you each are now in separate households. And you also have to think with these long-term marriages whether spousal maintenance is going to need to be paid out. So anybody who's in a long-term marriage needs to get marital counseling first, and then if they decide that one or the other decides they're getting divorced, I would seek an attorney, because those are high. Usually there's a lot of money at stake there.
Well, and even a financial advisor to predict, like, well, how much would you need to budget if you split up, and
And what's your freedom worth to you?
Right. And it's not saying
sometimes these people could stay together and be fine.
Right. Well, and it's not saying like stay in a bad situation, but if you're on the fence and you think that there's a possibility you could work it out, it might be worth trying that first is really the idea, because your life might not be better the other way around.
Right. But the grass is always greener. And so I do think that separation and if there are absent issues of violence again, or financial abuse or any kind of abuse, then take some time and figure out, take a trip, let that when that person goes on a trip, see how is life going to be without the other person, and then really go through the numbers. Because if you're a person who really prides themselves on having saved a lot of money and caring about that, you're going to fork it over. But these are the difficult clients, right? Because they are pissed about that. They are really mad that they are going to have to give that hard-earned money over. But they are. So accept it. That's a legal fact.
I know. I wish like at the front end, people, when like they're signing their marriage certificate, they would sign like an affidavit of understanding that just says, I understand that if this ends in divorce, 50% of my assets will be, I will only get 50% of my assets. I mean, that would be really kind of cool. I mean, maybe there is something so that people are just like, because they might not just be aware of that. They're in bliss and they're like, oh my gosh, this person's never going to do me wrong, except that a lot of people end up in divorce. And
I mean, to get married in Phoenix is $98. Okay.
Right. But to get divorced is a lot more expensive than that usually.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And it takes a lot longer, right? You can get married by running down to the courthouse, but then could take months and even like my parents years to get divorced.
Yeah.
So, okay, let me ask you more of a personal question, less of a logistical one, as we've talked through all these different reasons, and there's all sorts of other reasons people get divorced, but these are some of the main ones and kind of how they might affect the divorce process, right? They're going to show up differently in divorce settlements, divorce interactions, all of those things. But here's more of a personal question. If knowing some of these main reasons for divorce and knowing some of the reasons maybe you've broken up in relationships and maybe separated, would you do anything differently on the front end to minimize the chances of divorce?
Yes, absolutely. 100%. I am a divorcee.
Yeah. So what would you do differently if you were to consider getting married? Say you were considering getting married again. What would you do differently on the front end to minimize the chance of divorce?
Well, I'd go through everything. I mean, being a divorce attorney, I'd go through all the issues that would come up in a divorce, I don't have a lot of assets, so sorry. If someone wants to marry me, they're not going to get rich. And that's the thing that they have to understand as well, right? I think I would only get married at this age or older if it was truly like a real love match and we just wanted to get old together, right? And that this was going to be it. I would only get married again if I knew like, okay, this is it. And that means not being in the initial stages of really being into someone, and I would I'd get counseling. I would talk to a lawyer. I mean, I wouldn't, but I would advise other people to talk to a lawyer to figure out if this is a good decision. I mean, marriage is a legal contract. Marriage is a legal contract. So it's, you have to, I think even at the stage in being 50, almost 55, like having let, people move into the home that I live in now, and then them being resentful or irritable with me about it, do I even want to put myself through that again? When like I don't have to. Like I'm having a party next Saturday and I didn't have to ask anybody. And I forgot that I was having it, and my friends asked me if I was still having it. And I thought, God, this is the love, this is the joy of having my own house, being an adult and being single. Yeah, I'm having the party. Everybody come. You want to get drunk here and sleep on my couch? Awesome. I don't care. Like, there's a real freedom that I don't know that I would give up going forward in life, and that is, I am again, I want the comfort and love of another person, right? But thus far in my life, that doesn't really seem to have come without a lot of conflict. And, everyone could say, oh, that's your personality, Tracy, it's your fault. But I have friends who are such different personalities with me, and they're in the same boat. So I think it's just really hard to make relationships work. And those people who, find someone that they can be with forever, they're really lucky. But also, here's my word of caution, and it's going to sound rude, but there are people who think they're super in love and having a great marriage, and the other one is like out of the blue shocks them with some news. So don't be too arrogant if you're in like the great relationship, because I mean, I am dealing with people who were married for 35 years, for a long, long time, for 20 years, 15 years, you know? So, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I don't know. I have a lot to say. I mean, this is what I literally do all day long. So
you would consider all these reasons, you'd work through them beforehand.
I would still get married. I mean, you and I are different that way, but I don't have a lot of assets, so it doesn't really matter to me. But again, also though, I guess I would do a prenup, not because, well, I do care about my assets. See, I shouldn't diminish myself and say, oh, I don't care about my assets. I do care.
And you do have some assets.
Yeah, not many, but I mean, I do have this house. I still owe money on it. But like, I didn't save for retirement. I didn't work for years. I took care of other people's kids. I did all kinds of things that I messed around. I did, you know, I took jobs that weren't paying so I could go do adventure things. So I made choices in my life, right? And so the only reason I would get married is to like have the comfort of aging with somebody, like a real love to like be together. And you and I feel very differently about that.
Yes, because you know me, I do not intend to get married. I have always said that. Because for me, it's the legal contract doesn't make the emotional contract any stronger or weaker. I wouldn't rule it out if there was like one person was dying, and it would protect them, or if we were in a really, really horrible situation and needed healthcare benefits. Like there are those reasons that I would do it, but those would be legal reasons. Like it doesn't impact my emotional connection with people. I've had really great, loving relationships with people that I've not been married to. And I have great commitment to those people. But on the front end, before, would I do something different? If I were to get married, I would definitely do a prenup. I do a postnup. I do all of those things because I do want to protect my assets. And I do want to, protect my daughter's assets because they're hers too. I would also really work through some of the, check on the compatibility issues, how we handle conflict, past issues with like infidelity or addiction. I would want to know these things, and be able to make some informed decisions about whether or not I want to enter into a relationship with somebody, not even just a marriage, but do I even want to entertain a relationship with somebody who is, I may go on a couple dates, but if it's not, if it doesn't feel like,
and if somebody doesn't want to talk about those things, you need to bounce. Bounce. It's time to bounce, because all of that stuff should be talked about. And the only person who got really mad at me about that was a person who was lying to me.
Oh, interesting, right? Yeah. See, I think that's a great,
because my wife and I managed all the finances, which was all her money coming in from child support and her income. And I wasn't working, but I managed all of that and put all of the money in the house and her retirement and all that. And, she would like look at it once a year, like twice a year. And like, we had total trust in that arena, right? And then I dated someone who I wasn't even living with, who, we had some issues about, can we do some things? And there were financial issues, even though she made more money than me, had way more assets than me, and then couldn't do that. And I questioned, like, what is going on? And the fury and the rage came out. And then, that was like, okay. That's when I said I can't continue in this relationship if there's lying. Like, what is happening here? So that's when I put my foot down and said you have to go to counseling. And I went to the first counseling session because, I won't tolerate lying. Having had the life I've had, I'm willing to overlook a lot of stuff that, maybe some other people won't, like past trauma and all that. But the lying, if you're continuing that, if you're like continuing those kind of patterns, or secrecy, lying and secrecy, no goes.
Yeah, and that's good for you to know, because if that's a no-go at the beginning, it's going to be a no-go at the end and potentially push you over, especially if it develops during the course of the relationship, right? Like maybe there wasn't lying at the beginning and you're like, okay, great. And then you're, 4 years in, and then all of a sudden the lying starts and it's like, wait a minute, what's going on here? But knowing, and we have a great episode on, understanding what the red lines and the orange lines and the no-goes and all those are. And that's important. So, I mean, one of the biggest ways of preventing divorce is not staying with someone who you shouldn't, be with or don't want to be with. It's actually, on the front end, making some wise decisions about, is this right for me? And is this right for me right now? And
having time before you jump into a legal contract. Know this person. Go through a lot of tests with them. Mm-hmm. And if you're even contemplating marriage or living together, anything, you have the right to know about what's going on with their finances. You have the right to know about their history. I mean, I'm a very open book. I don't know if I've said this before, but my old police partner was like, Tracy, you don't have to go on a first date and tell them everything. And I'm like, yes, I do, because I was trying to get it out of the way, right? Because there are mass red flags and lying, secrecy, all of that. If a person doesn't want to be upfront about what their assets are, what their debts are, whatever, you shouldn't continue forward with them.
Well, and I'm also amazed, and I've never done this, but I've heard people who've done this where they're like, oh, well, there were so many red flags while we were dating, and I figured that once we were married, those things would sort of just go away, right? Like they would settle down, or I know that I've been cheated on, but now that we're married, I'm not going to be cheated on. And it's interesting because very, very little changes in terms of behavior once you're married than before you're married. And so thinking if you can't really tolerate those behaviors before you're married, they are not going to change after you sign a legal document. You just make it much harder for yourself to get out, to escape. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
If there are red flags like that you're saying, that people say like, oh, I saw these red flags and then I decided to get married, or our marriage is terrible, so we decided to have a child. Just don't. Do not. Do not.
I've seen people say that with kids. Like if we just have a kid, it'll bring us closer together. And,
or if they get pregnant, then they have that person's child, but they don't like that person. And I'm like, sorry, this is that person's child too. And that's the way the state's going to treat it. And I mean, good luck. I mean, those are really, really hard issues. And to bring children into the world, you better really think carefully about it, and you are going to be with that person and their issues for a long, long time.
Well, inarguably, if we share a child the rest of their lives, as I co-parent every day of my life, and it won't go away when she turns 18. So, making those choices. But again, I know some people are in situations where they went in and things were really good, things were intentional, things were great, and then they went south. And now they're trying to get out. And so, trying to find ways to support those folks. And that's what we're really hoping that this season will, give our listeners an opportunity to ponder some certain things, get some resources, hear from some experts, maybe consider other ways of looking at divorce as a way to be an empowering transformational experience that creates, like you said, Tracy, creates more peace, right? Rather than contention and angst and anger and ego and all of the other things that come with it. So I'm looking forward to this season. And even though it's kind of a topic where you're like, oh gosh, it's kind of a little bit heavier than the ones we've talked about, but it also feels like it's liberating, right? Because divorce can be a very liberating experience at the same time as it can be very sad and traumatic. And so how can we help make that process better, smoother, and less painful for our listeners? That's my hope.
All right. That's my hope too.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks to everyone for tuning in and listening to our episode as we start our season on divorce. And until we chat again, go out there and rock those relationships. If you liked what you heard, check out our show notes for resources from today's episode. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram under Rock That Relationship, and go to our website at rockthatrelationship.com for updated episodes and more great information.
Thanks for listening. Now go rock those relationships.